In the summer of 1885, federal investigators arrived at what should have been the thriving mining town of Quicksilver Creek, Texas, only to find empty streets, abandoned homes, and a silence so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself. What they discovered in the abandoned mine shafts would haunt the U.S. Geological Survey for decades. Detailed medical records documenting the systematic poisoning of over 300 men, women, and children, all signed by 7 brothers whose names would be quietly erased from official records. The Kruger family had turned an entire community into their personal laboratory, conducting experiments on mercury poisoning that produced scientific data so advanced it wouldn't be understood by mainstream medicine for another 50 years. Yet so horrific were their methods that no university would acknowledge their findings, no medical journal would publish their research, and no government agency would admit the studies ever existed. The brothers themselves vanished without a trace, leaving behind only their meticulous notes and a question that still echoes through the halls of medical institutions today. How far is too far in the name of scientific progress? Before we continue with the story of the Kruger brothers and their deadly experiments, I want you to know that this tale comes from recently declassified documents found in a Texas state archive. If you're fascinated by dark historical mysteries like this one, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss these forgotten stories. And please, let me know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. I love connecting with fellow mystery enthusiasts from around the world. What the investigators found that day would challenge everything they thought they knew about the limits of human cruelty disguised as scientific inquiry. The year 1885 found the American West in the throes of unprecedented expansion. The Transcontinental Railroad had been completed 16 years prior, and ambitious men with sharp minds and sharper business instincts were carving fortunes from the untamed landscape of Texas. It was into this world of opportunity and exploitation that Heinrich Kruger and his 6 brothers arrived from the industrial valleys of Prussia, carrying with them not just the calloused hands of experienced miners, but university educations that set them apart from the typical frontier prospectors. Heinrich, the eldest, at 42, had studied metallurgy at the University of Berlin before political troubles forced the family to emigrate. His brothers, Friedrich Wilhelm, Otto, Gustav, Bernhard, and young Klaus, each possessed specialized knowledge that would prove invaluable in their American venture. Friedrich had training in chemistry, Wilhelm in engineering, Otto in medicine, Gustav in mathematics, Bernhard in geology, and Klaus, despite being only 24, had spent years apprenticing in the dangerous mercury mines of Almadén, Spain. The brothers settled in what would become Quicksilver Creek, a natural depression in the Texas hill country where Bernhard's geological surveys had indicated the presence of cinnabar, mercury sulfide ore. The location was strategic, isolated enough to avoid unwanted attention, yet connected by a rough trail to the railroad depot in Junction, some 30 miles southeast. More importantly, it sat near several established routes used by migrant workers moving between mining operations throughout the Southwest. Within months of their arrival, the Kruger operation had attracted over 200 workers and their families. The brothers offered wages that were generous by frontier standards, $2 a day plus housing and medical care. This last benefit, provided personally by Otto Kruger with his medical training, proved to be a powerful draw for men whose dangerous profession left them vulnerable to injury and illness, with little recourse for treatment. The town that grew around the mine reflected the brothers' methodical German sensibilities. Unlike the chaotic boom towns that typically sprouted around mining operations, Quicksilver Creek was laid out in orderly blocks. The Kruger compound sat on elevated ground overlooking the settlement, a collection of well-built structures that included not only their residence, but also Otto's medical clinic, a laboratory where Friedrich conducted ore analysis, and a substantial office building where Wilhelm maintained detailed engineering records of the mining operation. What set the Kruger operation apart, however, was not just its organization, but its revolutionary approach to mercury extraction. Traditional methods involved heating cinnabar ore in furnaces, causing the mercury to vaporize and then condense in cooling chambers. The process was notoriously dangerous, as workers were inevitably exposed to mercury vapor, a neurotoxin that accumulated in the body over time, causing tremors, tooth loss, kidney damage, and eventually madness. The brothers claimed to have developed safer extraction methods, and indeed, workers noticed that the Kruger operation produced less visible vapor than other mercury mines. What they didn't realize was that Heinrich and his brothers had simply become more efficient at capturing and concentrating the mercury, not to protect their workers, but to control their exposure with scientific precision. Otto Kruger had established his medical practice in Quicksilver Creek with the stated purpose of monitoring worker health and treating mining-related injuries. He maintained detailed files on every resident of the town, documenting their medical history, family background, and any symptoms they might develop. To the workers and their families, Dr. Otto seemed like a godsend, a qualified physician who provided free medical care and took a genuine interest in their well-being. The reality was far more sinister. Otto was conducting the most comprehensive study of mercury poisoning ever attempted, using an entire community as his test subjects. His brothers had designed the mining operation not for maximum profit, but for maximum control over mercury exposure levels. Different work areas had different concentrations of mercury vapor, different shifts were exposed for precisely calculated durations, and workers were rotated through various positions according to a complex schedule that only the brothers understood. By the spring of 1885, several disturbing patterns had emerged in Quicksilver Creek, though the isolated nature of the community meant that few outsiders were aware of them. Workers began displaying symptoms of mercury poisoning much more rapidly than was typical in other mining operations. More puzzling still, these symptoms seemed to follow distinct patterns. Some men developed severe tremors while maintaining their mental faculties. Others showed signs of cognitive decline while remaining physically capable. And still others experienced a progression of symptoms that seemed almost designed to test the limits of human endurance. The first sign that something was terribly wrong in Quicksilver Creek came not from the mine itself, but from the town's children. On the morning of May 15, 1885, Margaret Donnelly was hanging laundry behind her small frame house when she noticed her 8-year-old son Thomas behaving strangely in the yard. The boy was walking in perfect circles, his arms held rigidly at his sides, his eyes fixed on some invisible point ahead of him. When she called his name, he didn't respond. When she touched his shoulder, he continued his circular path as if she weren't there. Margaret wasn't alone in her discovery. Across Quicksilver Creek, mothers were finding their children engaged in similar repetitive behaviors. Some walked in straight lines, turning precisely when they reached a wall or fence, then continuing in the opposite direction. Others stood motionless for hours, their hands moving in complex patterns that seemed almost like sign language, though they made no sound. Most disturbing of all, the children seemed unaware of their own actions. They would respond normally to direct questions, play with their siblings, eat their meals, but then return to these strange behaviors as if compelled by some inner force. Dr. Otto Kruger was summoned immediately. He arrived at the Donnelly home carrying his black medical bag and wearing the expression of professional concern that had endeared him to the community. He examined Thomas with thoroughness that impressed Margaret, checking the boy's reflexes, looking into his eyes with a small mirror, testing his responses to various stimuli. After nearly an hour, he pronounced that the boy was suffering from a minor nervous condition, probably brought on by the excitement of spring weather and too much rich food. Nothing to worry about, Mrs. Donnelly, he assured her in his careful English, still marked by a slight German accent. I've seen this before in mining communities. Something in the air, perhaps, or the change of seasons. I'll prepare a tonic that should have young Thomas back to normal within a few days. But Otto Kruger had not seen this before. He had created it. The children of Quicksilver Creek were displaying the first visible symptoms of a carefully orchestrated experiment in mercury exposure that had been underway since the town's founding. The brothers had discovered that mercury accumulated differently in developing nervous systems, and they had been systematically studying these effects by introducing controlled amounts of mercury dust into the town's flour supply, which was provided free to all residents as part of their employment benefits. The tonic that Otto prepared for Thomas Donnelly contained not medicine, but a precisely measured dose of mercury compounds designed to accelerate the progression of symptoms. In his private laboratory, Otto recorded detailed observations of the boy's condition, noting the exact timing of symptom onset, the specific nature of the repetitive behaviors, and the child's responses to various stimuli. This information was carefully catalogued alongside similar data from dozens of other children in the community. What made Otto's records particularly valuable and particularly horrifying was their comprehensive nature. Unlike other studies of mercury poisoning, which typically relied on post-mortem examinations or fragmentary observations, the Kruger experiment provided a complete picture of mercury's effects on human subjects from initial exposure through the final stages of the disease. The brothers had created conditions that allowed them to observe and document every phase of mercury poisoning with scientific precision. As the days passed, the children's symptoms intensified and spread. Parents who had initially dismissed the behaviors as harmless quirks became increasingly alarmed as their sons and daughters began losing weight, developing tremors, and showing signs of cognitive impairment. Some children stopped speaking entirely, communicating only through elaborate hand gestures that seemed to follow their own internal logic. Others became hypersensitive to light and sound, spending their days huddled in dark corners, emerging only when the sun set. The adult population of Quicksilver Creek was experiencing its own health crisis, though the symptoms were more familiar to anyone acquainted with mining operations. Men who had worked in the deepest shafts began developing tremors in their hands, making it difficult to perform delicate tasks. Some complained of painful tooth decay that seemed to progress with unusual rapidity. Others reported memory problems, difficulty concentrating, and sudden outbursts of anger that were completely out of character. What the workers didn't know was that their symptoms were not the unfortunate byproduct of dangerous work, but the intended result of a carefully controlled experiment. The Kruger brothers had divided the workforce into test groups, exposing different men to different concentrations of mercury vapor over precisely timed intervals. Wilhelm's engineering expertise had allowed them to create work areas with exact levels of contamination, while Gustav's mathematical training enabled them to calculate optimal exposure rates for different experimental objectives. Heinrich Kruger maintained the overall coordination of the experiment, ensuring that each subject received the intended dose of mercury while avoiding exposure levels that would cause immediate death. The goal was not to kill their test subjects, but to study the complete progression of mercury poisoning under controlled conditions. Death would end the experiment prematurely. The brothers wanted to observe every stage of the disease as it developed. As autumn approached, the true scope of the Kruger experiment began to reveal itself in ways that even the brothers hadn't anticipated. The mercury poisoning that had initially manifested in distinct observable symptoms began to create complex interactions within the closed community of Quicksilver Creek. Families were disintegrating as mercury-induced personality changes turned loving spouses into strangers and responsible parents into erratic, sometimes violent caregivers. James McReynolds, a foreman who had been one of the first workers hired by the Kruger brothers, exemplified the devastating progression of the disease. A steady, reliable man who had never raised his voice to his wife or children, McReynolds began experiencing episodes of explosive rage that would come without warning and leave him confused and remorseful. During one such episode, he destroyed most of the furniture in his home, then spent the following day meticulously repairing each piece while his terrified family watched from the neighbor's house. Otto Kruger documented these behavioral changes with the detached precision of a scientist observing laboratory animals. His records, written in a mixture of German and English medical terminology, described McReynolds' condition as Subject 47, male, age 32, exposure level C2, duration 14 months. Significant deterioration in impulse control, concurrent with preservation of technical skills and emotional awareness. Recommended increase to exposure level C3 to accelerate progression to next phase. The brothers had developed their own classification system for mercury poisoning, dividing the disease into carefully defined stages that allowed them to predict and control its progression. Stage A subjects showed only minor symptoms, slight tremors, occasional memory lapses, mild irritability. Stage B subjects developed more pronounced neurological symptoms, including severe tremors, dental problems, and personality changes. Stage C subjects experienced severe cognitive impairment, often accompanied by hallucinations, extreme behavioral changes, and physical deterioration. Most chilling of all was Stage D, which the brothers reserved for subjects they deemed ready for terminal observation. These individuals were provided with special housing in a section of town that other residents were discouraged from visiting, ostensibly for their own safety and comfort, but actually to allow for detailed study of the final stages of mercury poisoning without interference. By late 1885, nearly half the adult population of Quicksilver Creek had progressed to Stage B or beyond. The town that had once buzzed with activity and optimism had become a place of whispered conversations, sudden silences, and the constant undercurrent of barely controlled fear. Workers who had once been friends avoided each other, uncertain whether the man they'd shared a drink with the previous week might suffer a violent episode without warning. The children, whose symptoms had first alerted the community to the crisis, were progressing through their own carefully documented stages of mercury poisoning. Many had stopped attending the small schoolhouse that had been built during the town's early days. Those who did attend were often unable to focus on their lessons, spending long minutes staring at nothing while their teacher, Mrs. Elizabeth Hoffman, struggled to maintain order in a classroom filled with children whose minds were being systematically destroyed. Mrs. Hoffman herself was not immune to the experiment. As one of the town's few educated residents, she had been assigned to what Otto Kruger designated as group educational, subjects whose intellectual capacities were being monitored to determine mercury's effects on learned skills and cognitive processes. Her daily rations included precisely measured amounts of mercury-contaminated flour, and her drinking water was drawn from a well that the brothers had systematically contaminated to achieve specific concentration levels. The teacher began to notice changes in her own mental processes, difficulty remembering lessons she had taught for years, sudden confusion about simple mathematical concepts, and a growing tendency to lose track of time during the school day. She attributed these problems to stress and overwork, never suspecting that they were the intended result of a calculated assault on her nervous system. What made the Kruger experiment particularly insidious was the brothers' understanding of community psychology. They had structured their study to take advantage of the isolated nature of Quicksilver Creek, ensuring that residents had no external frame of reference for their experiences. When everyone in a community is simultaneously experiencing cognitive decline, behavioral changes, and physical symptoms, those changes begin to seem normal rather than pathological. The brothers reinforced this psychological isolation through careful manipulation of information. Mail delivery to Quicksilver Creek was handled through the Kruger Company office, allowing them to monitor and sometimes intercept correspondence. Visitors were discouraged through rumors of infectious disease, and the few outsiders who did arrive were hosted exclusively by the brothers themselves, preventing them from observing the true condition of the town's residents. Heinrich Kruger maintained detailed records not only of the medical aspects of their experiment, but of its social and psychological dimensions as well. His journals, written in a mixture of German, English, and coded symbols, described the breakdown of social structures within the community, the emergence of new behavioral patterns among the poisoned residents, and the effectiveness of various techniques for maintaining control over an increasingly unstable population. Just when it seemed that the situation in Quicksilver Creek couldn't become more disturbing, the brothers introduced what they termed Phase 2 of their experiment. Phase 2 began in December 1885 with the arrival of what appeared to be a medical supply wagon, but which actually contained specialized equipment that Heinrich had ordered from instrument makers in Chicago and St. Louis. The brothers announced to the community that they had secured the services of additional medical professionals who would be conducting advanced treatments for the various ailments that had been affecting the town's residents. Dr. Otto Kruger introduced his new colleagues, 3 men who wore white coats and carried themselves with professional authority, but whose credentials existed only in documents forged by Wilhelm, using his engineering precision and Friedrich's knowledge of chemistry to create convincing letterheads and seals. These were not doctors, but actors hired by the brothers to provide legitimacy for the next phase of their experiment. The fake physicians established what they called a treatment center in a large building that had previously served as the town's community hall. Residents were scheduled for appointments based on their progression through the brothers' classification system, with the most severely affected subjects receiving priority attention. What the residents didn't realize was that these treatments were designed not to cure their mercury poisoning, but to study its effects under even more controlled conditions. The treatment center contained equipment that would have been impressive in any major hospital of the time: examination tables with restraining mechanisms, apparatus for measuring reflexes and nervous responses, and devices for administering carefully controlled doses of various substances. The brothers had spared no expense in creating what was essentially a human laboratory, funded by the sale of their mercury to industrial customers, and by payments they had begun receiving from European universities interested in their research data. The university connections were perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire operation. Through correspondence networks established during their education in Germany, the brothers had made contact with medical researchers in Berlin, Vienna, and Edinburgh who were conducting their own studies of neurological disorders and industrial diseases. These researchers, working within the ethical constraints of European medical institutions, had been unable to conduct the kind of comprehensive, controlled studies that the Kruger brothers were performing in their isolated Texas community. Friedrich Kruger served as the primary correspondent with these European contacts, translating the brothers' data into academic language and organizing it according to the research interests of various universities. The institutions receiving this information were told that it came from a private medical practice serving industrial workers in the American frontier, where regulatory oversight was minimal and patients often consented to experimental treatments in exchange for free medical care. The European researchers, hungry for data that would advance their understanding of occupational diseases and neurological disorders, asked few questions about the methodology behind the Kruger studies. They published papers based on the brothers' research in prestigious medical journals, catapulting their own careers while remaining willfully ignorant of the human cost of the data they were using. Meanwhile, in Quicksilver Creek, the treatment center was producing its own horrifying results. Subjects who entered the facility for their appointments often emerged in worse condition than when they arrived, though the deterioration was subtle enough that it could be attributed to the natural progression of their illnesses. The brothers were using these sessions to test various compounds and procedures, determining which interventions accelerated mercury poisoning, which had no effect, and which might actually slow the disease's progression. One of their most disturbing discoveries was that certain combinations of mercury compounds, when administered in precise sequences, could produce specific types of neurological damage while leaving other brain functions intact. They found that they could destroy a subject's ability to form new memories while preserving long-term recall, or eliminate emotional responses while maintaining intellectual capacity. These findings, carefully documented and transmitted to their European contacts, would eventually contribute to advances in neurology, but at a cost that no ethical researcher would have considered acceptable. The children of Quicksilver Creek were not exempt from Phase 2. Otto Kruger had established a special program for young subjects, ostensibly designed to provide educational support for children who were struggling academically due to their health problems. In reality, this program involved psychological testing, experimental treatments, and carefully monitored exposure to various mercury compounds to determine their effects on developing nervous systems. Young Thomas Donnelly, whose repetitive walking behavior had been among the first signs of the community's crisis, had progressed through several stages of mercury poisoning under Otto's careful observation. By December 1885, the boy showed severe cognitive impairment, spoke only in single words, and had developed a pronounced tremor that made it difficult for him to feed himself. Rather than providing treatment for these symptoms, Otto was using Thomas to test theories about the reversibility of mercury damage in young subjects. The boy's mother, Margaret Donnelly, had also been affected by mercury exposure. Though her symptoms were different from her son's, she experienced episodes of confusion and memory loss that made it difficult for her to recognize the full extent of Thomas's deterioration. When she expressed concern about her son's condition to Dr. Kruger, he assured her that the boy was receiving the best possible care, and that his symptoms were actually showing signs of improvement. This manipulation of families was a crucial component of the brothers' strategy. By carefully managing information and exploiting the cognitive effects of mercury poisoning on parents and spouses, they were able to maintain their experiment even as subjects became increasingly incapacitated. Family members who might have questioned the treatment their loved ones were receiving were themselves experiencing the mental fog and emotional blunting that characterized mercury poisoning, making them less likely to challenge medical authority or seek outside help. As winter deepened, the isolation of Quicksilver Creek became even more complete. The rough trail connecting the town to Junction became nearly impassable due to heavy rains, and the brothers used this seasonal isolation to implement the most extreme phases of their experiment. They began what they termed terminal studies, detailed observations of subjects in the final stages of mercury poisoning, conducted in a special facility they had constructed specifically for this purpose. The facility, which residents were told was a hospital for the most seriously ill members of the community, was actually a death house where the brothers could study their subjects during their final weeks or months of life. The building was designed with observation areas that allowed for continuous monitoring, record-keeping stations where the brothers could document every change in their subjects' conditions, and areas for post-mortem examinations that would reveal the full extent of mercury's damage to human tissue. But even as they prepared for the culmination of their experiment, the brothers were beginning to realize that their activities might not remain secret indefinitely. Federal interest in mining operations was increasing, and there had been inquiries from territorial authorities about the unusual health patterns reported in various Texas mining communities. The brothers began taking precautions to protect their research and themselves should outside investigators eventually arrive in Quicksilver Creek. The first indication that the outside world was beginning to take notice of Quicksilver Creek came in February 1886, when a territorial health inspector named Dr. Samuel Patterson attempted to visit the community as part of a broader survey of mining-related illnesses throughout Texas. Dr. Patterson never made it to the town itself. His horse was found 3 days later, grazing peacefully beside the trail some 15 miles from Quicksilver Creek, while the doctor himself had simply vanished. Heinrich Kruger made no official report of finding Dr. Patterson's body, but his private journals contained detailed observations of what he termed subject terminal external, a man who had died from what appeared to be acute mercury poisoning after consuming water from a contaminated source. The brothers had apparently intercepted the health inspector before he could reach the community, subjecting him to a concentrated dose of mercury that killed him within hours while providing valuable data about the acute effects of mercury exposure on previously healthy subjects. Dr. Patterson's disappearance prompted additional inquiries from territorial authorities, but the brothers were prepared for this eventuality. Wilhelm had spent months creating false records that portrayed Quicksilver Creek as a marginally successful mining operation with a small, stable workforce. Friedrich had prepared samples of ore and mercury that showed normal levels of contamination, no different from dozens of other mining operations throughout the region. Most importantly, Otto had coached the town's residents on how to respond to questions from outside investigators. The coaching process revealed the full extent of the mercury poisoning's effects on the community's cognitive abilities. Many residents could no longer remember their lives before arriving in Quicksilver Creek, while others had difficulty distinguishing between their actual experiences and false memories that Otto had implanted during their treatment sessions. The brothers had essentially created a population of witnesses who could not provide accurate testimony even if they wanted to betray their captors. By spring 1886, nearly the entire population of Quicksilver Creek was showing signs of advanced mercury poisoning. The brothers had achieved their goal of conducting the most comprehensive study of mercury's effects on human subjects ever attempted, but they were now faced with the challenge of concealing evidence of their experiment while preserving their research data. Heinrich began implementing what he called the final protocol, a systematic plan for eliminating all traces of their activities while ensuring that their scientific findings would survive for future study. The plan involved several phases, each designed to remove specific types of evidence while maintaining plausible explanations for any discoveries that might be made by future investigators. Phase 1 of the final protocol involved relocating the most severely affected subjects to the isolated hospital facility, ostensibly to provide them with specialized care during their final illness. In reality, the brothers were concentrating their terminal subjects in a single location where they could conduct final observations while preparing for the systematic elimination of witnesses. Phase 2 involved the destruction of all physical evidence of their experiment, dismantling the specialized equipment in the treatment center, burning medical records that contained incriminating details, and removing all traces of the mercury contamination systems they had built throughout the community. Friedrich's chemistry expertise proved invaluable during this phase, as he was able to neutralize mercury contamination in ways that would prevent future detection. Phase 3 was the most chilling aspect of the final protocol. The brothers had determined that their experiment could not be allowed to be discovered by outside authorities, both because of the legal consequences they would face and because premature revelation of their research methods might prevent the scientific community from properly evaluating their findings. They began systematically eliminating the most severely affected subjects, using methods that would appear to be natural deaths from mercury poisoning, while actually being carefully administered overdoses. The elimination process was handled primarily by Otto, whose medical knowledge allowed him to determine precise dosages of mercury compounds that would cause rapid death, while leaving tissue damage patterns consistent with advanced mercury poisoning. Each death was carefully documented, with post-mortem examinations conducted immediately to preserve tissue samples and record final observations about mercury's effects on various organ systems. Just when we thought we'd seen the full extent of the horror in Quicksilver Creek, the brothers' final phase intensifies beyond imagination. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this tale of scientific obsession gone terribly wrong. By summer 1886, the population of Quicksilver Creek had been reduced from over 300 residents to fewer than 50. The brothers explained these departures as voluntary relocations, claiming that many families had decided to seek opportunities in other mining regions or return to their home states. In reality, most of these missing residents had died from mercury poisoning and been buried in unmarked graves scattered throughout the hills surrounding the community. The surviving residents were primarily individuals who had shown unusual resistance to mercury poisoning. Subjects whose genetic or physiological characteristics had made them valuable for extended study. These survivors were maintained under increasingly strict controls, their daily activities monitored constantly, and their contacts with the outside world completely eliminated. Klaus Kruger, the youngest brother, had begun expressing doubts about the continuation of their experiment. His experience in European mercury mines had made him familiar with the typical progression of mercury poisoning, but he had never imagined the systematic, comprehensive study that his brothers had created in Quicksilver Creek. As the body count mounted and the evidence of their activities became more difficult to conceal, Klaus argued for ending the experiment and fleeing to Mexico or South America. Heinrich rejected his youngest brother's concerns, arguing that they were on the verge of completing the most important medical research of the century. The data they had collected, he insisted, would revolutionize the understanding of neurological diseases and industrial medicine. To abandon their work at this crucial phase would be to waste the sacrifices already made and deprive humanity of knowledge that could prevent future suffering. But even as Heinrich argued for the continuation of their experiment, external pressures were mounting that would soon make their position untenable. The territorial government had dispatched a more senior investigator to determine what had happened to Dr. Patterson, and this new investigator was bringing federal marshals with the authority to conduct a thorough search of any mining operation they deemed suspicious. On the morning of August 15, 1886, Deputy U.S. Marshal William Hendricks arrived at the outskirts of Quicksilver Creek with a small team of federal investigators and a warrant authorizing them to search the Kruger mining operation for evidence related to Dr. Patterson's disappearance. What they found would haunt them for the rest of their lives and create a cover-up that would last for more than a century. The town that greeted Marshal Hendricks bore little resemblance to the thriving community that had existed just 2 years earlier. Most of the houses stood empty, their windows dark and their yards overgrown with weeds. The few residents they encountered appeared to be suffering from severe illness. Trembling, hollow-eyed individuals who spoke in whispers and seemed confused by simple questions about their circumstances. At the Kruger compound, the brothers received the federal investigators with the calm courtesy of men who had prepared extensively for this moment. Heinrich presented them with mining permits, tax records and employment documents that appeared to be in perfect order. Wilhelm provided detailed engineering surveys of the mine operations, while Friedrich offered to demonstrate their mercury extraction processes. Otto stood ready to explain the medical problems that had affected some of their workers, attributing the symptoms to the unfortunate but predictable hazards of mining operations. But Marshal Hendricks was not easily deceived. His years of experience investigating frontier crimes had taught him to recognize the difference between legitimate hardship and something far more sinister. The condition of the surviving residents, the absence of so many people who should have been present, and the unnaturally calm demeanor of the brothers themselves all suggested that Quicksilver Creek was hiding secrets that went far beyond a missing health inspector. The breakthrough came when Hendricks discovered Otto's treatment center. Despite the brothers' efforts to remove incriminating evidence, they had been unable to eliminate all traces of the specialized equipment and procedures that had been used there. Hidden beneath floorboards, the investigators found medical instruments that had no legitimate purpose in treating mining injuries, chemical apparatus designed for conducting experiments rather than providing therapy, and most damning of all, fragments of record books that Otto had thought he had completely destroyed. The partial records that survived the brothers' cleanup efforts revealed the true scope of their experiment. Page after page of detailed observations documented the systematic poisoning of hundreds of subjects, the careful manipulation of mercury exposure levels, and the cold, scientific monitoring of human suffering on an unprecedented scale. The investigators realized they were looking at evidence of the most comprehensive medical experiment ever conducted on unwilling human subjects. Friedrich attempted to explain away the records as research conducted with the full consent of subjects who had volunteered to participate in exchange for free medical care. He argued that the brothers had been conducting legitimate studies of occupational diseases that would benefit workers throughout the mining industry. Heinrich supported this explanation, presenting correspondence with European universities as evidence that their work was part of the international scientific community's efforts to understand and prevent industrial illnesses. But the marshals had discovered too much evidence to be satisfied with these explanations. In the isolated hospital facility, they found the bodies of subjects who had died during the final phases of the experiment, some still lying on examination tables where they had been studied during their death throes. In the hills surrounding the town, they began uncovering unmarked graves containing the remains of residents who had been eliminated during the brothers' final protocol. Most horrifying of all was the discovery of living subjects who were in the terminal stages of mercury poisoning, kept alive not for treatment but for continued observation. These individuals, including children as young as 6 years old, had been reduced to barely functioning shells of their former selves, their minds destroyed by months or years of systematic poisoning, while their bodies clung to life just long enough to provide the brothers with complete data about mercury's effects on human physiology. The investigators also found evidence of the brothers' connections to European universities and medical researchers. Correspondence files revealed that data from the Quicksilver Creek experiment had been shared with institutions in Germany, Austria, and Scotland, where it had been used to advance careers and publish research papers. The international implications of the case were staggering. Prestigious medical institutions had unknowingly built their reputations on data obtained through systematic human experimentation. When confronted with this overwhelming evidence, the brothers' responses revealed distinct personality differences that had been shaped by their roles in the experiment. Heinrich remained defiant, arguing that their research would ultimately save thousands of lives by advancing medical understanding of mercury poisoning. Wilhelm focused on the technical aspects of their work, insisting that their methods had been scientifically sound, even if their implementation had been flawed. Friedrich emphasized the international significance of their findings, claiming that European scientists would vindicate their research once the full scope of their discoveries became known. Otto's response was perhaps the most chilling of all. The brother who had served as the experiment's primary physician showed no remorse for the suffering he had caused, instead expressing frustration that the investigation had interrupted his work before he could complete his studies of mercury's effects on child development. He argued that the surviving subjects represented irreplaceable research opportunities that would be wasted if the experiment was terminated prematurely. Only Klaus showed any sign of conscience, admitting to Marshal Hendricks that he had tried to convince his brothers to end the experiment months earlier. But even Klaus's confession was self-serving, as he attempted to minimize his own role in the atrocities while positioning himself as a reluctant participant who had been coerced by his older brother's authority. The federal investigators faced an unprecedented dilemma. The evidence they had uncovered documented crimes of such magnitude that prosecuting them would require trials that might last for years and attract international attention to American mining practices. More troubling still was the realization that the brothers' research, however obtained, represented genuine advances in medical knowledge that could benefit future generations if properly evaluated and applied. The decision of what to do with the Kruger brothers and their research was made not by Marshal Hendricks, but by officials in Washington who understood the broader implications of the case. In September 1886, a team of federal investigators arrived in Quicksilver Creek with orders to conduct a complete assessment of the situation and recommend a course of action that would serve the national interest while preventing similar atrocities in the future. The assessment team included medical experts from Johns Hopkins University, legal advisors from the Department of Justice, and intelligence officers whose primary concern was preventing foreign governments from gaining access to the brothers' research data. After 2 weeks of investigation, during which they interviewed survivors, examined the evidence, and consulted with various government agencies, the team reached a conclusion that would shape the official response to the Quicksilver Creek experiment. The brothers' research, they determined, was too valuable to be simply destroyed, but too dangerous to be made public through normal legal proceedings. The systematic nature of their experiment had produced data about mercury poisoning that was decades ahead of contemporary medical knowledge, information that could be crucial for protecting American workers in mining and industrial operations. At the same time, revealing the methods by which this data had been obtained would create international scandals that could damage American prestige and provide foreign governments with propaganda materials. The solution they recommended became known as the Quicksilver Protocol, a plan for preserving the brothers' research while ensuring that knowledge of their methods remained classified indefinitely. The protocol involved several components, each designed to extract maximum benefit from the situation while minimizing potential damage to American interests. First, the surviving subjects of the experiment were relocated to a federal medical facility in Colorado, where they would receive the best possible treatment while remaining under government supervision. These survivors, including the children who had been subjected to developmental studies, were provided with new identities and cover stories that explained their medical conditions as the result of industrial accidents. None of them were ever allowed to speak publicly about their experiences in Quicksilver Creek. Second, the brothers themselves were given a choice between prosecution for mass murder and cooperation with ongoing government research programs. Heinrich, Wilhelm, Friedrich, and Otto accepted positions with a classified military research division, where their expertise in human experimentation would be applied to studies of chemical warfare and battlefield medicine. Klaus, who had shown signs of conscience during the investigation, was offered exile to South America with a new identity and sufficient funds to start over. The brothers who accepted government positions were relocated to a remote facility in Nevada, where they continued their research under strict federal supervision. Their work during the following decades contributed to advances in military medicine, chemical warfare defense, and industrial safety protocols, though none of their research was ever attributed to their real names or connected to the Quicksilver Creek experiment. Third, and most importantly, the brothers' research data was carefully preserved and classified at the highest levels of government secrecy. The detailed records of mercury's effects on human subjects became part of a larger database of information about chemical and biological agents that would prove invaluable during both World Wars and the Cold War. Medical researchers working on government contracts were given access to selected portions of the data, though they were never told about its origins. The town of Quicksilver Creek itself was systematically erased. Buildings were dismantled, graves were relocated, and all physical evidence of the community's existence was removed. The mine shafts were sealed and the land was transferred to federal ownership, officially designated as unsuitable for development due to environmental contamination. Maps were altered to remove references to the town, and railroad records were modified to eliminate evidence of the transportation routes that had served the community. Perhaps most chillingly, the federal government used the Quicksilver Creek case as a model for future covert research programs. The techniques that the Kruger brothers had developed for maintaining control over unwilling subjects, manipulating community psychology, and concealing evidence of human experimentation became part of the operational manual for classified government research projects. The Quicksilver Protocol was refined and applied to numerous other cases over the following decades, whenever government agencies needed to conduct research that could not be performed through legitimate channels. The European universities that had unknowingly published research based on the brothers' data faced their own difficult decisions when American intelligence agencies quietly informed them of the true origins of their work. Most chose to suppress their publications and destroy related records rather than face the scandal that would result from public revelation of their connection to human experimentation. A few institutions attempted to investigate how they had been deceived, but their inquiries were discouraged through diplomatic pressure and veiled threats about the consequences of publicizing classified American research activities. The survivors of the Quicksilver Creek experiment spent their remaining years in federal custody, though their treatment was more comfortable than their earlier experiences. The government provided them with excellent medical care, comfortable living conditions, and carefully monitored social interactions with other survivors. However, they were never allowed to leave the federal facility, never permitted to contact relatives or former friends, and never given the opportunity to tell their stories to the outside world. Margaret Donnelly, who had lost her son Thomas to the brothers' developmental studies, lived until 1923 in the Colorado facility. Her mercury poisoning had caused permanent memory damage that prevented her from providing coherent testimony about her experiences. But government physicians who treated her documented the long-term effects of mercury exposure with the same scientific precision that had characterized the original experiment. Her medical records became part of the classified database that grew out of the Kruger research. Thomas Donnelly himself survived until 1891. Though the child who had once walked in perfect circles had been reduced to a barely functioning shell of his former self. Government researchers continued to study his condition until his death, using his case to understand the long-term developmental effects of mercury poisoning on young subjects. His death was recorded in classified files as Subject QC-47, Terminal Observation Complete. The four brothers who had accepted government positions continued their research for nearly 2 decades, applying their expertise to projects that remained classified well into the 20th century. Heinrich died in 1903, taking with him detailed knowledge of human experimentation techniques that had been refined far beyond what he had achieved in Quicksilver Creek. Wilhelm survived until 1912. Long enough to contribute to early military research on chemical weapons. Friedrich and Otto both lived into the 1920s, their later work focusing on industrial medicine and occupational safety programs that benefited American workers without revealing the horrific origins of their expertise. Klaus Kruger, the brother who had chosen exile over government service, disappeared into the jungles of Colombia and was never heard from again. Intelligence agencies maintained surveillance of South American German communities for several years, watching for any signs that he might attempt to reveal the story of Quicksilver Creek. But no such revelation ever occurred. Whether he died shortly after his arrival in South America or lived quietly under an assumed identity, his fate remained unknown. The classified files related to the Quicksilver Creek experiment were stored in government archives, where they remained untouched for decades. During the 1970s, when congressional investigations began examining unethical government research programs, some officials considered whether the Kruger files should be declassified as part of broader transparency efforts. However, the scope and systematic nature of the brothers' experiment was deemed too sensitive for public revelation, and the files remained classified. It was only in the late 1990s, when a routine archival review was conducted as part of government modernization efforts, that portions of the Quicksilver Creek files were finally declassified. Even then, most identifying information was redacted, and the location of the experiment was obscured through the use of code names and altered geographic references. The researchers who reviewed these files for declassification were struck by the advanced nature of the brothers' work and the comprehensive scope of their data, but they were also horrified by the human cost of obtaining such information. Today, the land where Quicksilver Creek once stood remains under federal ownership, officially designated as part of a wildlife preserve. Visitors to the area find no markers or monuments indicating that a community ever existed there. No evidence of the mine shafts that once employed hundreds of workers, and no hint of the systematic human experimentation that took place in the isolated Texas hills. The mercury contamination that once made the site unsuitable for development has long since been neutralized, but the federal government maintains ownership to prevent any archaeological investigations that might uncover evidence of the town's existence. The medical advances that grew out of the Kruger brothers' research have saved countless lives over the past century. Modern understanding of mercury poisoning, industrial safety protocols that protect workers from chemical exposure, and treatment methods for neurological disorders all trace their origins, in part, to the systematic observations made in Quicksilver Creek. But the ethical cost of this knowledge continues to haunt the institutions that have benefited from it. In European medical schools, students occasionally encounter references to mysterious American research from the 1880s that provided unprecedented insights into mercury poisoning. The professors who teach these courses know only that the research was conducted under frontier conditions where ethical oversight was minimal, unaware that they are describing one of the most comprehensive human experiments ever conducted. The brothers' data continues to influence medical practice, though its origins remain hidden beneath layers of classification and deliberate obscurity. Perhaps the most disturbing legacy of the Quicksilver Creek experiment is its influence on subsequent government research programs. The techniques that Heinrich and his brothers developed for maintaining control over unwilling subjects, for manipulating community psychology, and for concealing evidence of human experimentation, became part of the institutional knowledge of American intelligence and military research organizations. The Quicksilver Protocol was applied to dozens of other classified research programs throughout the 20th century, each building on the foundation laid by 7 German brothers in an isolated Texas mining town. The complete truth about Quicksilver Creek may never be fully revealed. The classification systems that protect the brothers' records also ensure that their story remains fragmentary, told only through heavily redacted documents and carefully controlled disclosures. The survivors who might have provided first-hand testimony died decades ago in federal custody, their experiences known only to the government physicians who treated them and the researchers who continued to study their cases. What remains is a mystery that challenges our understanding of scientific ethics, government accountability, and the price of medical progress. The Kruger brothers achieved their goal of conducting the most comprehensive study of mercury poisoning ever attempted, but they did so through methods that violated every principle of medical ethics and human dignity. Their research advanced human knowledge while simultaneously demonstrating the depths of cruelty that can be justified in the name of scientific progress. The 7 brothers who disappeared into government service after the destruction of Quicksilver Creek took with them secrets that continue to influence American medical and military research to this day. Their legacy is written not in published papers or acknowledged contributions to science, but in classified files that document both their achievements and their crimes. They succeeded in creating scientific knowledge that has benefited humanity, but at a cost that no ethical society should ever be willing to pay. This mystery shows us that the line between medical progress and human exploitation is thinner than we might like to believe, and that institutional secrecy can preserve both valuable knowledge and horrific crimes for generations. The Kruger brothers understood that scientific advancement often requires crossing ethical boundaries, but they also understood that some boundaries, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or do you think there are still secrets hidden in those classified files? Leave your comment below and share your theories about what really happened in Quicksilver Creek. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves dark historical mysteries. The truth about American history is often stranger and more disturbing than we could ever imagine. And there are countless other stories waiting to be uncovered. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another forgotten chapter of American darkness that science refuses to acknowledge.